speaker to come and chat with us today, and we really do appreciate you giving up your time. Just in terms of the format for today, I think Shiro has said he'll speak for around 30 minutes or so that there's plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. We will welcome questions both from the people in the room, but also our online audience. If you are online, there is a Q&A function in Teams. Please post your questions there. If you have any technical queries, just use the usual chat function. And if you are online and in the Q&A, please feel free to vote on questions that you like and would really like me to ask of Shiro during the Q&A session. Do that by just doing a thumbs up or some such thing as well too. So I think that's it for me. Ngā mihi nui, and over to you, Shiro. Welcome very much.
Well, thank you very much, Kieran, and thanks everyone for this opportunity to talk about some ongoing research. And yeah, as you say, it's pretty timely. We've been, I guess, a group of us at the ANU, but colleagues around the region too, thinking about these issues like everyone else is, but in a concentrated manner for a few years now, in fact, before COVID. And the situation continues to get worse. The trajectory we're on doesn't seem to correct. And uncertainty continues to grow. But delighted to be here at Treasury to talk about some of these issues because we've been primarily trying to think about how we can avoid, or how we can get economics back into economic security, if you will. So I think early on, the response to all the uncertainty was driven by, understandably, security interests, but economists had kind of vacated the field in academia and elsewhere. And a lot of the responses were being driven by thinking from international relations scholars, international political economy and security scholars. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that economists weren't really involved too much. And you saw, I think, responses of governments pointing economic weapons at themselves, for example. And I think we've come a long way since then, but let me talk through some of the issues. So I think the starting point, it's worth remembering that this is a source of security in our part of the world, in fact, for a lot of the world. And here I've got two crumbling pillars here, but the two pillars of our post-war security are, of course, the US alliance system, but also the rules-based economic system, the rules-based multilateral trading system. And these were negotiated in the dying stages of the Second World War at Bretton Woods to avoid a 1930s style collapse of a system where you then had economic rivalry, beggar thy neighbour policies that fed economic deprivation and indeed conflict. So these rules, the institutions of Bretton Woods, but the rules and the principles that were negotiated weren't naive to the security threats and to the risks. They're very much front and centre. But thinking about how to avoid those prisoner's dilemma outcomes that we saw in the 1930s. So sort of start with a conclusion at the bottom here that I'll get to in the end. But really, what's the strategy got to be? It's holding the system together. The United States has exited the system, but hold it together for eventual US re-entry. How to deal with China? I'll argue to enmesh China in more markets and more rules. And what has to guide us through these uncertain times in whatever arrangements and policy measures is a key principle of equal treatment. So that's most favoured nation principle. And that, I would argue, is the way forward for small and middle powers, but it's a necessary condition for a rules-based system. Excellent. So worth just reminding ourselves what the multilateral trading system is and what it does. It's not just the WTO, but it's the WTO at its core. And all the bilateral regional arrangements and negotiated deals that sit on top of it. It sustains cooperative outcomes and avoids non-cooperative prisoner's dilemma outcomes. That should be fairly clear, I think, but important to remind ourselves, and we're slipping back towards that kind of world now. The other core function it plays is replacing a power-based bargaining system with a rules-based order. And again, this is the choice of a might is right world or rules-based order. And I don't think you need to look too far other than Northeast Asia to see where countries can engage in trade and economic integration despite unresolved history, political mistrust, political and regional rivalry, and a bunch of political relationships that are really up and down. So it's a system that's allowed countries to, with confidence, to open up to the global economy and let market forces determine trade patterns and trade shares. And importantly, as I'll show in a few slides, it's this openness and an open global economy that is the biggest protection for small and middle powers. It is that openness that blunts economic weaponry or economic coercion. That was the case for Australia and China against Chinese trade sanctions from 2020. And it's an open global economy that has plenty of substitute buyers and sellers. That is a source of resilience. So it's open contestable markets that is a big source of economic security. And I would argue, and I think there's a fair bit of evidence for this, that concentrated trade and market power is a temporary phenomenon. And the more you abuse that market power and use it for political leverage, the quicker you're going to lose it, as everybody scrambles to find alternatives. So you lose trust, of course, by deploying the economic weaponry, and there's now a whole lot of effort to substitute away from you. So let me talk about the big powers before I come back to, so I should give a trigger warning for this picture, but before I come back to what some of the other problems are and the responses. But I would argue, and I think this is fairly well accepted and acknowledged by everybody, this is not just a Trump phenomenon. It's a structural challenge within the United States, stems from inequality, of course, and I guess the Biden administration, between the two Trump administrations, is a clear enough sign that this is not Trump as the main cause, but he's also just representing a symptom of the problem there is in the United States. So, this is not a problem that's going to resolve itself, whoever the next president is, immediately. There's not going to be any reversion to pre-Trump. We're in a post-Trump world. You can imagine any future president, whether Democrat or Republican, is not going to be able to reduce tariffs so easily or quickly or reverse the inward lookingness. They'll be looking for concessions from other countries, for starters. But this is where Trump's zero-sum worldview is a bit of an extreme representation of this, where everything is seen in zero-sum terms that actually lead to negative sum outcomes. Think about Prisoner's Dilemma outcomes. Those are lose-lose, whereas there are positive sum, mutually beneficial outcomes if you're able to maintain cooperation. The United States is walking away from and actively undermining most favored nation treatment, not just through the agreements on reciprocal trade that they're coercing other countries into signing. They're normalizing this power-based bargaining world. So this is a United States that's taking itself outside of the system that it helped create and was the key country in enforcing and underpinning in the post-war period. And in the meantime, we're going to have to live in a trading system and a rules-based system minus the United States, where they are actively a source of uncertainty for that system. And then, of course, you turn to China, that has deployed economic coercive measures, of course, nothing compared to what the United States has done recently. But we're having adjustment problems in the rest of the world too, especially in the United States, but in Japan and more so in Europe, that compete actively with Chinese manufacturing. And so you have this idea of a China shock 2.0 that's supposedly flooding everyone with cheap goods that we can't compete with. Now, in Australia and New Zealand, it's probably pretty welcome having cheap, subsidised, even if they're not subsidised anymore, but competitive green goods, for example, to help our energy transition. But there is an adjustment problem in the rest of the world. But importantly, with China, that's often seen as a source of all the problems by those in the United States and elsewhere. I think it's worth remembering, and reminding ourselves, it's obvious that they have a stake in the established system and the established rules. A big sign of that is them signing up to this MPIA, Multi-Party Interim Appeals Arbitration Arrangement, another awkward acronym in the trade space. But after the WTO dispute settlement system stopped functioning, couldn't enforce multilateral trade rules since 2019, Canada and the European Union led the creation of this MPIA, which New Zealand, Australia, and China were founding members of. So we've put our hands up to be held accountable to the rules, the WTO rules, in a parallel process. So that's a pretty important signal, and one that is being used, and in fact was the exit ramp for Australia's trade tensions with China. So questions about overcapacity, excess capacity in China are a problem for some countries, but thinking about being under capacity too, globally in green goods, I think we need to start to think about adjustments in China, but the adjustment processes outside of China. And I would argue that a Chinese economy, so there's a lot of arguments to decouple or de-risk or distance ourselves from the Chinese economy, as the US economy is doing. A Chinese economy and society that is less integrated into the global economy presents more risks, not less. And I'll come back to that. I just want to show you, you've probably seen various different versions of this, but the episode of Chinese trade sanctions against Australia in 2020, of course, China accounted for about 40% of Australia's exports, and the political relationship deteriorating led to a blockage of about a dozen goods worth about 20 billion Australian dollars, where China was the biggest market. And this was barley, coal, timber, wine, lobster, not iron ore, importantly, which they have no substitute for quality or quantity for at least a decade, but probably more. Now you can see for barley, coal and timber, exports to China stopped overnight, very painful for the exporters of these goods, but picked up elsewhere globally as China sourced coal, barley, timber, and everything else, including wine from the United States, but sourced these goods from other countries. And Australian exporters were able to find other markets to export to. So the open global economy was the best protection for us. Of course, a flexible economy at home with a macroeconomic framework that targets full employment was crucial to this adjustment process as well. But this was the defense against economic weaponry. So whatever the shock from the outside, whether it's a financial crisis or politically motivated trade sanctions, flexible markets, open markets are our best defense. And as I said, the exit ramp for this was the WTO and the Chinese willingness to abide by those rulings. But in response to measures like that and Chinese economic coercion episodes elsewhere, countries naturally lose a lot of trust. The cost of doing business in China becomes higher, and countries are deploying economic security strategies. And I would argue a lot of these would seem to make sense independently or individually, but you start to think about the implications of some of them, and then together, if other countries are deploying them, it can be quite damaging to the actual system that is there to protect us, that open system. So ideas of friendshoring and reshoring, they of course raise costs because they make our world smaller. first trying to identify who your friends are, and then trying to concentrate trade or investment among a smaller group of friends, a smaller group of countries, very difficult and very costly. Defensive industrial policy, of course, if you can afford it, still very expensive, and the opportunity cost is significant. And we've got countries now deploying a host of export restrictions in the name of security or economic security. I think companies, of course, diversify and spread risk. Once this starts to get to a systemic level where governments are hell-bent on diversification and diversifying away from your biggest markets, for example, or the lowest cost sources in the name of security, got to be pretty careful about getting the balance right, I think. So there are some areas, of course, where it would make sense, but how does that square with what we know works of specialization in comparative advantage? Surely there's quite a big tension there where diversification is the opposite of specialization in comparative advantage, and choices will have to be made. But I think it's incumbent on us to do some cost-benefit analyses, for example. A lot of friendshoring or reshoring or onshoring, ally shoring, of course, concentrates risk instead of spreading it, and a retreat from equal treatment and MFN towards these sorts of policies are going to be adversarial and entrench, will turn temporary rivals into permanent adversaries in some cases. So I think on top of that, just thinking about the relationship between prosperity and national security, I think this is a challenge that we're all facing as the world becomes more complicated and security risks increase. And we do need to take security risks seriously, of course, but we can't have those security risks dominate everything. So existential security risks, that are quite often tail risks, need to be taken into account, but they can't be given an infinite price, of course, because that leads us towards corner solutions. No amount of prosperity is worth catastrophic security outcomes. And however you want to draw this relationship, we can quickly move towards a North Korean corner solution. But there are other ways to think about this, of course. It's not a one-for-one trade-off. It's not always substitutes between prosperity and security. You can think about them being complements. Working with other countries in a multilateral space can help expand policy choices and increase strategic policy space. But of course, you can retreat to policies that narrow some of those options. So moving the frontier in or out, simple kind of extension of a guns and butter type model, but worth thinking about, because you can think about policy choices that make you both more secure and prosperous, and those that make you less secure and make you poorer, and how to work with other countries to preserve this policy space that we have. So it's there. I just want to zoom out a bit. And, I think we, as an economist, and probably most of you in Treasury probably think about trade and security or prosperity and security in the same way, where, of course, you've had for centuries this debate raging about whether trade is a cause of peace or a cause of conflict. And Baron de Montesquieu here, of course, famously saying peace is a natural effect of trade. And we're used to thinking about the peace dividend or the commercial peace. Economic integration raises the costs of conflict. It's not an ultimate constraint against conflict. In World War I, we saw countries very economically interdependent go to war with each other, but it is a pretty serious increase in cost. Of course, none other than Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations said, yes, it ought to be, but in fact, among nations, as among individuals, a bond of union and friendship, this is what trade is supposed to be, has become the most fertile source of discord and animosity. And we can see how trade conflict is leading to a source of discord and animosity between countries, because countries start to worry about the vulnerability and sensitivity you have from opening up your trade with other countries, especially if that trade or economic interdependence is being weaponized against you. But how do you square Montesquieu and then a generation later, Adam Smith? Surely it's a system within which you're operating, and confidence in a set of rules, or one where you're in the 1930s and economic policy measures and trade policy is a source of vulnerability, opening yourself up to other countries, a source of vulnerability and risk. So we've enjoyed a post-war system where the countries signed up to it could enjoy this peace dividend from trade, whereas I think the Adam Smith warning you can see all throughout history, and even especially today, between particular countries. And this is where something I'm trying to think through now. Of course, everyone is talking about increasing trade with trusted partners or like-minded countries. Sounds pretty sensible. You need a lot of trust in a partner to trade. But this is, it's not a source of long-term resilience, security, or reliability. It's actually a revealed response to a weakening of the institutional credibility rather than a first best policy choice. So instead of trusting that contracts are enforceable and the system's going to stay open and government policy isn't going to change in a punitive manner suddenly, we've had that confidence in a system until now. With the United States walking away from this system and the weaponization of trade becoming more common, countries are having to think about trading with trusted partners and finding trusted counterparts instead of trusting the rules and the enforcement of those rules. So trust-based trade is not a substitute for rules, it's evidence of their erosion. And I think we're heading down a dangerous path if we continue this way, and with those economic security policies, as I mentioned before, they're very much second-best solutions in response to the uncertainty and the security risks and the weaponization of trade that actually help erode and damage the system that protects us the most from these risks. So I've been very negative so far. Let me try to shift to be a little bit more positive and talk about some of the initiatives in our region and what more we can do. So you wouldn't really expect ASEAN to be a beacon of hope in this kind of gloomy world. ASEAN that's very difficult to deal with, toothless, am I treading on something? Sorry. Toothless and disorganized. But as a group of economies in our neighborhood that have trade to GDP ratios well above 100%, that rely on integration with the global economy, with the big partners in China, Japan, the United States, but Europe as well, and not just trade within Southeast Asia. ASEAN's response in the last 12 months, I think, has been, I was calling it textbook, I think it's a masterclass. Some little qualms at the edges of this, but for those of you who haven't seen this, this is the geoeconomic report that ASEAN produced. They set up a geoeconomic task force, and this is pretty important, recognizing that a breakdown of the trading system would hurt ASEAN's economic security the most, given how exposed they are and how much they see economic integration as a source of security, not just prosperity. The ASEAN economic ministers in February last year set up a geoeconomic task force and agreed in February not to retaliate against tariffs that are coming, not to deploy beggar thy neighbour policies in response to uncertainty, and to deepen economic integration and abide by the rules they'd signed up to in the WTO and other arrangements, including in response to floods of Chinese goods into particular sectors, only to use measures that were legal in the WTO and other arrangements. So that's in February, before Trump announces his reciprocal tariffs on Liberation Day on 2nd of April. And then this geoeconomic task force starts to make recommendations like the political security pillar of ASEAN should meet with the economic pillar of ASEAN. So the ministers met together. They produced this report and they recommended a leaders meeting for RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership trade arrangement. So this is some agency expressed by ASEAN. It's a good start. They, of course, many of the ASEAN members signed agreements on reciprocal trade with the United States that completely undermined these efforts and were inconsistent with MFN, divert trade significantly. But the explanation there is you're being bullied and you're paying a very high price to reduce uncertainty. Now, that uncertainty hasn't gone, hasn't disappeared. In fact, just in the last few days, there's another investigation into many of these countries' trade practices from the United States. But this is an ongoing process in ASEAN that I think tries to bring economic and security interests together. So this is the RCEP leaders meeting in Kuala Lumpur last year. And we have in Southeast Asia now a group that has its back against the wall and recognizes that and is doubling down on multilateral principles. And in this leaders meeting, they made it quite clear that WTO reform is central, their multilateral interests are central, and that security interests are now, cannot be ignored in economic affairs, but they're going to bring them together. So I think this is something that, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the region really has to double down on work with ASEAN closely. A little bit awkwardly, initially when the ASEANs were trying to get this idea for a leaders meeting up, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea were not so keen on a leaders meeting, but came around thanks to ASEAN diplomacy. So how do we build these coalitions? What do we build them around? Well, seems like a technical long acronym, the MPIA, the enforcing the rules among a small club. That club is growing. So the WTO rules are enforceable among almost a third of WTO membership now. Gradually more countries are signing up. Japan signed up late, Philippines, Malaysia, and so forth. This can function as a temporary workaround. It's shown as an effective plurilateral arrangement. So the questions about how we can expand this beyond WTO rule enforcement, how we can expand the membership. Some very important economies like Indonesia are not members. But thinking about a key question that's guiding my thinking from a couple of slides ago, actually, how can we gain confidence again in high trade shares and concentrated markets? They're seen as a risk and a vulnerability now, thinking about critical minerals and over-reliance on China. And they're seen as a vulnerability because they've been weaponized. But how can we build confidence and trust in high market shares? Because that's how we became rich. That's how we've prospered. That's how New Zealand has concentrated its exports in a few sectors like Australia has, and successfully so. Well, just on the critical minerals, it's a bit of an idea, but hopefully something creative that we can think about in other spaces too. We do have the Chinese signing up to these arrangements and expressing their interests in existing arrangements and wanting to join the CPTPP, for example, as does Indonesia. Well, that's leverage for Australia, New Zealand, and the other members. Every single CPTPP member has a veto on new membership. So sensibly, you'd have a process, not an accession process, but a process prior to accession that has China agreeing, put Indonesia here as well with their nickel exports and downstreaming, agreeing to and implementing reforms along a pathway towards accession, just as China did in another world when it acceded to the WTO. 15 years negotiating entry into the GATT and the WTO. It made commitments and built trust over that 15 years by unilaterally liberalizing, locking in openness, and giving others confidence. If there's a process like that that has China agreeing to reforms, now it's very difficult, state-owned enterprise reform, towards competitive neutrality, for example, but that is a productive process that we could engage the Chinese in. If they don't meet the standards and the benchmarks, you don't let them in. But why not put conditions on in a legitimate process, like a treaty level agreement as part of the CPTPP? They're not allowed to restrict exports of natural resources or critical minerals. Final slide. Again, I come back to how do we do this? Openness guided by principles, and we're in a world of bottom-up rulemaking. Talking about plurilaterals, we're talking about small groups of countries, like when New Zealand got together with Chile, Brunei, and Singapore, was it, to form the P4, became the CPTPP. All these examples of small and middle powers taking the initiative and building from the bottom up. That's the world we're in, and we need to be a bit more strategic in how we do this, I mean, collectively, and have equal treatment, MFN, guide us as a key principle. And then we can start to think about tackling difficult issues regionally and in small groups of willing countries, like dealing with subsidies. What are legitimate subsidies for the green transition? What are protectionist subsidies that we need to rule out? Having groups of countries agree on those. And the security exception in the WTO has been let loose, especially now with the United States, but even before then. How can we come together as groups of countries, codify a national security exception, have more countries sign on to this, understanding that, you know, what is a national security issue and what's not, what is just protectionism. So a few ideas there, hopefully give a bit of meat on the bones to Mark Carney's idea of variable geometry. In this part of the world, of course, the rules-based order is not dead. The trading system still functions. If it didn't, and if the system was dead, we'd be in a whole lot more trouble. So I think it's incumbent on us to work collectively with our partners in Asia to keep the system from functioning and to reform the system so it's relevant for new ideas, new issues. Excellent. Thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
The fundamentals, so open, competitive markets still really, really matter in today's world, and it's actually part of how we think about economic security, particularly from a small open economy perspective. I'd also be interested in your observations at some point too on the current conflict in the Middle East, and where you've talked about second best policy traps that we might be falling into, whether that might be entrenching some of those, because we are certainly seeing reports of restrictions being posed, or whether that might be something that opens up the discussion again moving forward as well too. So really, really interested in your perspectives on that at some point as well too. But I'm now going to open up the floor for questions. Just to let you know, if you're online, I haven't got the microphones on at the moment because we are in quite a small room, but if anyone online is having difficulty hearing us, let us know through the chat and we will get the microphones back. But first of all, I will open up the floor to questions. Christy.
So I guess I wonder if you could expand on why you think equal treatment is necessary. I mean, the allocation of surplus amongst different countries is potentially quite unique. And if we think about the UN, we've actually got a Security Council where there's unequal decision rights as well. So what prevents the rules-based order from having unequal outcomes?
Yeah. Oh, look, I think in the economic space, you want equal treatment, a level playing field. You want to encourage competition and have testable markets. So that means you can have good competition and bad competition, right? Sort of zero-sum strategic competition or mutually beneficial economic competition. And how do you structure it? Well, if you have an unlevel playing field riddled with discrimination, that pretty quickly you start to lose firms, governments, societies lose confidence in opening up to other markets if you're discriminated against. Trade is distorted and has to follow the flag, for example. This is the whole idea of, taking this trusted trade too far, where you don't have a level playing field. You have politically motivated trade and trade following the flag. We know that makes you it limits your options and you're much poorer. So having Australian exporters, as soon as the barley restrictions in China were lifted, through a case at the WTO, as soon as they were lifted, Australian barley producers were right back in, because it showed that they're not going to be discriminated against, and that the rules actually still worked, and that's the biggest market. And then the question becomes, well, if you're hit by another shock, you can adjust, instead of, well, let's just retreat from that market because we're going to have constant discrimination against us. And so we can't have confidence in engagement again. Now, that seems like a bit of a stretch, right? You suddenly cut out of the market, politically motivated reasons. But the fact that those sanctions were lifted, I think, were very important. And they were lifted consistent with the rules that the Chinese had signed up to, and demonstrated they still have a stake in those rules because they're so exposed, the biggest trading nation in the world. They need those rules, and we need to recognise that they need those rules to protect themselves and their economic security. It was a bit of a rambling answer, but I can't see how in the economic space you can have a level playing field without equal treatment, and how you can have a set of rules without equal treatment either, a set of rules-based system. Otherwise, we pretty quickly on a pathway to might is right.
Any other questions from the floor? And can I just ask people to introduce themselves and where they're from when they ask their questions? Shiro.
Yes, Stuart from the Treasury. I'm very sympathetic to your arguments, but I just wonder whether you're being too optimistic, believe it or not. Because both in time and breadth, it seems to me that the breakdown of the World Trading Order goes back quite a while. This is not just one administration. It's not a matter of waiting out the United States. This goes back decades. You've seen it gradually erode. And it's not just a US issue. You've seen coercion from China. You've seen EU. So why is that dynamic there, and why would it be corrected?
Look, I don't mean to suggest that this rules-based system and the economic order ever functioned perfectly, but it did have the United States as the largest and most powerful economy in the world largely abide by and enforce those rules. Now, they would demur from those rules. They tried to do it with a straight face, but and this is where I think Carney goes a little bit in the Davos speech, where he says it's all a facade. We played along. That open global economy mattered for us, so it did work. It still works and still functions. Countries are still signing trade agreements, and trade is growing. Trade is growing, especially between developing countries. So it never worked perfectly, and yes, we always had problems. In fact, you could have talked about this being an existential crisis for the WTO in 2018, or even earlier than that, when WTO rules are completely out of date. They were at least enforceable, completely out of date. We're signing a lot of bilateral agreements that don't seem to be doing too much. Now, it turns out that those are very helpful on top of the multilateral system for holding the system open. But I think to counter your point, maybe I'm being too optimistic. I'm trying to find solutions through this mess. But the system did function, and it functioned well for us. There's no way New Zealand, Australia, and Southeast Asia would open their markets to trade with potential adversaries or non-allies in the way that we did and build trade if we didn't have confidence in this system. So it worked, and it still works. And I think it's incumbent on us to protect what still works.
Part of the issue there, sorry, and I'll just use Chair's license to ask this question, that where we're falling down a little bit now is enforcement, right? So the rules are actually there we, broadly most countries, not all, but most would agree to them. But the problem is the lack of enforcement through the global trading system now, which then opens up the space for people to be ever more creative about what they do.
Yeah.
How do we, and you've talked about this sort of WTO -1 arrangement that's been set out, but how do we get through that? Because without enforcement, there's no point in having any rules.
Yeah, so I mean, the good news is that a lot of the WTO members that have put their hand up to join this NPIA voluntarily, they're quite significant economies. Chinese economy, for example, or the European Union, and a growing number of countries. And I think it's worth the diplomatic effort to try to encourage other countries to join. But more than that, this is where a lot of the bottom-up rulemaking is quite helpful, because you do have new disciplines, new norms, negotiated practice through bilateral and regional agreements. So again, it's far from perfect, but it's never been perfect. And you can see countries still have development and growth imperative that requires trade. And so look at trade is growing with China. Chinese trade with the rest of the world is growing, especially with the developing world. Now, the risk is then a fracturing of that system into blocks, and we know that that's going to be costly, and lots of friends or like-minded countries or whatever, however you cut it. So trying to do everything guided by multilateral principles and not cutting countries out, I think is crucial, because like I mentioned, every time you restrict exports or restrict trade because you don't want to be too dependent on a country, you're unwinding some of that economic interdependence. Well, especially with China, that's been a very important force for stability and been a backstop on deteriorating political relations. I have to look any further than Japan and China relations. Bumpy yet again, but economic interdependence is extremely high. You start to unravel that economic interdependence because of risks, the very real risks, and you're starting to loosen those constraints on the politics between countries.
There's a question online here, which is, what's the analytical framework that tells you how much efficiency you should sacrifice for security? Or is the honest answer that liberalism doesn't have one, and that's the gap that the securitizers are trying to fill?
Oh. Well, that's a good question. I've been going around asking people, when they're thinking about economic security policies, where's the line between what's sensible economic security policy and what's naked protectionism? No one's been able to tell me. I don't have an answer yet. But we have companies who are making these decisions all the time, trading off efficiency for security, having stockpiles. I mean, just look at the Japanese and they're major importers of rare earth metals and processed rare earth elements from China. Built up huge stockpiles, not that expensive, but not cheap, and subsidizing heavily production elsewhere. These are companies and the government. So if the private sector is building in buffers, I think we've got to be pretty careful in policy terms of going a bit too far and doubling down on that. We'll start to, for instance, if you start to mandate that these companies have to have stockpiles and large inventories, that is throwing sand in the gears of already very costly economic integration. So I don't have a clear answer for that, at least not off the top of my feet, but I'm trying to think about that. That's a key issue that I think we should be asking ourselves when we're deploying these policies. Governments are responsible for managing the systemic risks and the blind spots and the externalities. We have to figure out where do we actually need to intervene where risk tolerance is too high. And governments do this all the time anyway. It's the board. Don't let particular sources of foreign investment into your defense technologies, for example. So I think
small yard, high fence that Jake Sullivan talked about is probably a fairly useful idea and way to think about it. But you can quite quickly see this security breaches and those small yards quite quickly become large yards with high fences. So without providing a solution, I provide more problems for that.
And there's something here about that, how much balance to put between creating stockpiles and redundancies in the system versus how you improve the absorptive capacity, I guess, of the economy to adjust when these sorts of shocks happen, which I guess goes back to your open trading environments point as well to some extent.
It comes back to your first observation before the question started, actually, of these second best policies, especially when you've got energy security problems and what we have now with conflict in the Middle East. If we're implementing second best policies, which we always have to, and we have to be pragmatic, I think trying very carefully not to implement policies we can't easily undo, that aren't too costly. We have some guiding principles, I would have thought, and that's probably one I would think is important.
Back to the room again. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Libby Flatt, New Zealand Customs Service. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on your idea of accessions to free trade agreements. So with the idea of China or Indonesia acceding to CPTPP, if they reform themselves up to that CPTPP gold standard, that would be awesome. Do you think there would have to be, though, a commitment from CPTPP to like seriously consider or, you know, start that accession working group with these countries once they've got to that level, or would them just hoping that would be the case be enough?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't see any way that there's, when I think about the reformers in China or Indonesia or elsewhere needing to argue the case at home to lock in reforms, you know, the vague hope of maybe this grouping considering letting you start an accession process isn't exactly a big carrot that's dangling. Yeah, and this might not get anywhere, that the Chinese might not be interested, they might lose interest in this. But I think you need a proper process that is a legitimate process like the WTO process, where the Chinese and the Indonesians and others can do what's in their own interest on a pathway towards this grouping that benefits all of us if they can meet the standards. I think it's thinking about the counterfactual of keeping this Chinese economy outside of the system as opposed to letting it in meets these standards that we want for it, because getting rid of the state-owned enterprise, unlevel playing field in China, getting rid of some of its powers to restrict exports, that's all in our interest, I think. And again, binds them in more markets and more rules. That's in our interest. So what are some, not even creative, what are some legitimate ways of being able to do this? Right now, they're not even being considered for accession. Got Uruguay and Costa Rica being in front of the queue for CPTPP accession, Philippines and Indonesia being pushed to the back of the queue, and still there doesn't look like that's going to be a very smooth process or linear or straightforward process. And the Chinese aren't even being considered by one. So that's not a very helpful stalemate, I wouldn't have thought, that provides no incentive Chinese to lock in any reforms or do anything themselves. And it shouldn't be incumbent on the outside world, understanding that can affect through these bigger groupings and affect the Chinese reformers trying to lock in reform. Indonesian president announced a whole deregulation agenda after Liberation Day. It was the right thing to do, but it went nowhere. Got a problem with implementation. Whereas if you can provide some momentum and impetus from the outside and hold their feet to the fire, then it gives a bit more credibility to the president's announcements and all the people trying to implement, or the ministries trying to implement. So yeah, I think you need a proper process if you can do stuff seriously.
a semi-related question in here, which talks about the growing number of bilateral, plurilateral and multilateral free trade agreements in Asia. Each has got their own sort of rules and dispute settlement mechanisms sitting within it. How do you think that's affecting regional integration and I guess the coherence of the global trading system? Because you talked initially about a plus, so you have the multilateral trading system and then you have the bilateral and plurilaterals on top of that really that. But you know, is that creating, I guess, more complexity in the system? Or you know, what are some of the institutional approaches we could start thinking about to ensure more effective dispute resolution in that I guess crowded field without fragmenting the system further?
Yeah, so I guess a couple of responses to that. This whole stumbling block versus building block argument goes back a long way. But I think so being a bit more strategic with the agreements. Now, the bilateral dispute settlement mechanisms or systems don't usually get activated. Countries prefer to go to the WTO. It's less adversarial, and it's in a broader framework. Now, point about whether these bilaterals are helping you get to where you want to or hurting. I guess they have to be consistent and complementary. So we're just here for the RCEP officials meetings, and we've got a group from outside. RCEP is a case where the region, led by Indonesia and ASEAN, tried to get this regional, or did get this regional agreement together to consolidate all the noodle bowls. It was spaghetti strands of regional agreements to consolidate into one. We keep negotiating bilateral agreements within that kind of erode RCEP. Countries and firms don't use the RCEP provisions enough because we're using bilateral provisions. So there's a kind of awkward tension there. Now, they're complementary to an extent, but if you have mechanisms in a regional agreement that extend bilateral provisions within that group, you'd have a ratcheting up effect. So I think you can think about these creatively. The other thing on dispute settlement I'd mention is this idea of an anti-coercion instrument that sort of has been adopted in the European Union, almost being considered in the G7, for example, to act as a deterrent against economic coercion, collective response. But I think the G7 wisely moved away from that because you're at once creating a sort of vigilante mob rule kind of mob justice arrangement that takes you outside of the established rules. And that immediately weakens the WTO dispute settlement. It's already weak and close to dead, but it still functions. But if Australia joined a small economic NATO or anti-coercion instrument like that against China, then we'll have no chance of resolving these issues in the WTO. And we're into kind of zero-sum world. So I think that's a pretty dangerous, by how I described it. I don't think that's a very good idea.
From the floor again. It's
To quote Lenin, which doesn't happen in the Treasury very often, but sort of what is to be done, for New Zealand, a smallish middle power in Asia. What's your sense of where we should be putting our economic statecraft energy to kind of build, this power in a union? Like, do we need to be like we were creative with creating the P4 or other kind of initiatives? Where should we be putting our investment dollar and our diplomacy and our energies at this particular moment? What's your sense of where to go?
I think part is being clear what your interests are and getting right at home, getting your house in order. So having the right frameworks to be able to answer the difficult questions like where's the line, getting the balance between prosperity and security so you're not moving towards corner solutions, and working on your macroeconomic framework. I mean, this is sort of bread and butter for Treasury. I don't need to be saying that, but I think you need to remind people these are the important protections, and then to prosecute your international interests. Because openness starts at home. You get that right. You use your international economic diplomacy or economic statecraft where you've got most leverage and most effect. And New Zealand is vice chair of the WTO ministerial next week. I mean, that's pretty important. You're part of CPTPP, RCEP, initiated the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. I mean, this is pretty important stuff, I'd say, and to continue to think about creative ways to work with the region in wrapping the Chinese into more markets and more rules, and system preservation. And this is where I would argue against so many more bilateral agreements. I remember it must have been 10 or 15 years ago, a delegation from New Zealand Treasury, Canberra, and came to see me and said, we've signed 42 free trade agreements with our top 43 trading partners. What should we do now? Maybe stop signing bilateral free trade agreements, was my answer. But, you know, renegotiate them, sign more, keeps trade negotiators busy. But I think that's where we need to be a little bit more strategic. And New Zealand has been more strategic and more proactive with these smaller group bilateral arrangements, for example.
I think Australia and New Zealand can be collectively doing in this environment?
Well, we've got the Closer Economic Relations Agreement, which is gold standard. So trying to, and our interests are the same, right? Protection of the open multilateral system and engagement in our own backyard in Asia. So working together to keep that Closer Economic Relations Agreement strong, but try to export some of those features of CER to the rest of the world. It's not easy to do and not straightforward, but how can we build in more confidence and work on behind the border trade issues, that's where all the action is, despite Trump and his tariffs. It's all behind the border regulatory coherence that's slowing integration down. So it's a MFAT and Treasury agenda, if you will, not just an MFAT agenda or the thought. And we've got the assets and the arrangements in our region through APEC, through the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand bilateral, but importantly the RCEP agreement too. So it's making sure those function well. I think it's pretty crucial for Australians.
Why? Yes, Chris.
Hi, Chris from the Treasury. You mentioned that countries are increasingly engaging in defensive industry policy. Can you expand a bit on the types of industry policies countries are engaging in? Also interested in your thoughts about whether these are necessarily just about economic resilience or whether you think there's a productivity dividend from these as well.
Yeah, so I mean, you don't have to look too far. I think we've got Future Made in Australia for what I think is can be justified energy transition. And when you start to look at the details of what the other pillar, the national interest framework on economic resilience looks like, it sits very awkwardly with the energy transition pillar because it starts to worry about economic security risks, i.e. China. China is going to be an important source of technology, green goods, IP, capital for our green transition. But the other pillar is going to, it looks like it's going to restrict that. So getting that balance right in Australia is one thing, but you look around the world, what is damaging industrial policy that's protectionist? I mean, I think there are a fair few areas you can look at. Japanese are back to the 1980s in their industrial policy. Huge subsidies for semiconductors. In fact, the government has 17 priority sectors and they're spending huge on all the 17 sectors. They're not prioritising within the 17. So there needs to be, I mean, there has to be a recognition that every economy now is, almost everyone, even those that can't afford it, are back to industrial policy or deploying new types of industrial policy for good reason, but quite often without restraint. So having some principles and some constraints and some agreements decided in groups of countries, used to be the WTO would be the venue for this, but to help constrain some of what your politicians would want to do anyway and spend a huge amount of money. So for instance, in Australia, subsidies to solar panel production and trying to pick winners in quantum computing looks like defensive protectionist industrial policy to me, or at least just a waste of money picking winners. And South Korea and Japan are looked upon as successful by some successful cases of industrial policy in the 80s and beforehand. But I think if you talk to people who've studied anything to do with that period, an export-led growth model, completely different settings, catching up to the technological frontier, you're importing technology, broad-based subsidies, you can see some winners, but huge amounts of waste. So always asking what the counterfactual was. And if we are moving into this world of bigger involvement of government, we want broader-based support instead of picking winners for starters. And you don't have to look too far around the world to see governments are back to picking winners big time. I don't think we've gotten better at picking winners. So I worry a little bit about that. Losers are very good at picking governments, subsidising zombie claims. So that's the risk. So having some agreement on what's legitimate green subsidies, for example, and what looks like just protectionism can help guide some policy making at home. And hopefully you can negotiate this into rules so it constrains you much more.
It's a question on the chat just around Taiwan and what impact that has on, I guess, this multilateral coalition that you see emerging in ASEAN as well, and how that might influence the way that moves.
Sort of whether they're part of these coalitions or whether, I mean, it's going to be very difficult in arrangements like CPTPP to move forward with Taiwan without moving forward with China. It is, again, a lifetime ago, but they're both in APEC, both acceded to the WTO at the same time. I don't think it's impossible to have a process where you work on both at the same time. And I've always argued in Taiwan's case anyway, it's an advanced economy, high standards. It's in its own interest to align those standards and continue to reform and stay open. It doesn't actually need formal membership of these arrangements to reap most of the benefits. So that would be the starting point for me for the Taiwanese economy, is to reach that standard without use the incentive that those agreements provide to get yourself to those standards anyway. Then you have regulatory coherence with other CPTPP members. You don't need the actual legal text to trade and integrate more closely, if that makes sense.
Any other questions from the floor? I've got two, Jimmy first, and then back to Christy.
Hi, Jimmy from the Treasury. Thank you very much. Just on Singapore, do you think Singapore has any unique perspectives and objectives distinct from ASEAN generally? And do you have any suggestions on what New Zealand can do collectively with Singapore?
Interesting, yeah. So Singapore has broken through the technological frontier, if you will, and GDP per capita above the United States. Very successful. And from my understanding, does pretty well. It was a pretty good job of training officials to move between different ministries and different interests, and then bring them together in the Prime Minister's office for some proper scenario planning. So, they have to do this for strategic reasons. They're very exposed on all fronts, and so decisions they make have to reflect economic, social, security interests. And so my understanding is they do that quite well. And I guess you can see they've done that very well. They've got to be agile and friends with everyone, signing agreements with everyone. And I think, whether you think about Singapore and New Zealand as small powers or middle powers, we're all small open economies that have to work together. So I think what we do, individually and bilaterally, not a whole lot, but using our leverage in regional arrangements or plurilaterals or bigger arrangements is where I think you'll get much more traction. Especially if, and I think you know this in New Zealand, but of course even from an Australian perspective, it's coming to these arrangements with ideas, with a track record of doing stuff at home yourself. That's sustainable leadership, and treating everybody equally. And so you're much more an honest broker in these arrangements. That's what I'd argue, I suppose.
Steve.
Yes, so Christy, I'm also from the Treasury. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about sort of vetoes on memberships in these types, about the merits or demerits. And I guess the examples that I'm thinking of are NATO membership, where Hungary and Turkey are kind of reluctant to allow Finland and Sweden to join.
Yeah, look, let me stick to the economic sphere, the trade agreements, because I don't know enough. I'm not a security scholar or anything, but you know, you think about new agreements and arrangements and how to accept others and build the membership. CPTPP brought the UK in. That was more of a process than the UK thought it would be. But I mean, there are different ways to expand membership, and these things are very helpful if they are open session and have, you know, like the security, or maybe it's the same as security space, and the trade and economic space. We want to expand these arrangements so they are stepping stones and not stumbling blocks towards a more multilateral, inclusive system. Naturally, they are a bit discriminatory because they favour insiders and members. But then we have agreements like APEC that are outward looking. And I think most of the ASEAN arrangements, even though they've got some discrimination built in with differential tariff rates, they are more open than otherwise. Now, you know, you can have accession processes where if accession criteria are transparent, and if countries meet those criteria, it's almost automatic. Or you can have something like the CPTPP, where it's a bit more of a black box, and you have to have every single other country, every member agree to let you in. That doesn't facilitate rapid expansion of membership. Right? So if you have countries agreeing to the standards, demonstrating that they can and signing a treaty level agreement, I don't see why you shouldn't let more countries in and expand. And this is the approach that New Zealand's taken with DEPA, I think. So it's called DEFA, Digital Economy Framework Agreement. Countries can pick and choose what they sign on to, and you don't stop them. Transparent conditions. And I think you want these bottom-up arrangements to grow and be meaningful. They have to appear open, but they have to also be open to new membership. Otherwise, you're creating blocks, trade blocks that are exclusionary and do the opposite of what's mutually beneficial in the economic space.
So that's a really nice segue into a question online that was one of the earlier questions, actually, where one of your opening comments was about the lack of an economic perspective and the prevalence of security trade currently. So what kind of organising structures, say for a country like New Zealand, a small country, would be suitable to make sure that we are sort of trying to align that economic views with how we think about security and trade and all of those sorts of issues, and foreign policy in particular? Sort of comes back to the conversation you and I were having earlier about how do we almost get foreign policy, security and economic to be talking the same language and getting the same action.
That's a big question. I mean, I think crucial to those decisions is going to be getting the frameworks right, developing the frameworks, having a strong treasury is always countries, a finance ministry, and not one that gets, you know, because the world is more uncertain and security risks are higher, security interests completely dominate. I think that's when you start to worry that you're moving in corner solutions or policies that make you poorer and weaker or less secure. So I think learning from other countries and working with other countries is pretty important, but I don't see too many cases where anyone's got this right yet. Everyone's still, even the Singaporeans, trying to sort this out. We need to do it collectively. I think this is where, yeah, I don't know. New Zealand starts to develop better frameworks, and I think it starts with small things like doing cost benefit analyses and security risks you can't properly measure, but that shouldn't be an excuse for giving it an infinite price, for example. I think a lot of countries are making mistakes as they go, and that's to be expected. Trying to figure out what's legitimately insurance policy, what's protectionism. So that's
great. I think we're coming to the end, so I just guess one further question from me. If there was one thing that you thought New Zealand shouldn't do in the current circumstance, what would it be? And if there's one thing that you think we should do in the current situation, what would that be?
What do you think it should be?
I'm asking you.
So I think one thing New Zealand shouldn't do is retreat into itself because of the rising uncertainty, and the world is too complicated and too hard, and you're at risk of getting whacked, your exports getting restricted, and so becoming over-securitized. I think that would be a real worry because others are moving in that direction, varying paces and back and forth. New Zealand, Singapore, and like others, understands, I see, its clear interest in remaining open and agile, and I think that's something that should just continue. So that sort of answers both of your questions. What we need, and what should New Zealand do? Be proactive like you usually are, but be strategic as well as being proactive. I think that's pretty necessary given where the world is at. And this is, getting those frameworks right that I couldn't answer about the balance between these things. New Zealand policy experimentation and being innovative, getting those right is a huge asset to other countries, and exporting some of those models can help us navigate some of these difficult choices where we're getting narrower and narrower policy choices. So that's what I hope from New Zealand, and high hopes for Treasury to sort that out.
Right, it's a high bar. We like high bars, so great. Anyway, thank you again, Shiro, for coming today and sharing your insights with us. I think it's a really fascinating overview of what's going on in ASEAN in particular, but how that might impact the way we think about things in the rest of the world as well too. So thank you very much for sharing those insights with us. And thanks to everybody for joining us today, whether it's in the room or online for the Treasury Guest Lecture Series. Public service announcement, our next seminar is on the 30th of April, and we will hope you will join us again. We'll be hearing from Dr. Alan Bollard on the weaponisation of economic policy and how New Zealand should respond. So once again, highly topical, and registrations for that event will open shortly as well too. So if I can just close this event with our Treasury karakia, piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te ora, huye, tae. Thank you everyone, ka kite, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Listen to Alan's